So, as with many of you, I grew up as a kid loving Halloween just because it's one of those you're like, I don't know what creeps and not creepy people, but like just fun things are out there. What house is decorated really well? If I go to the door and go to that old skeleton hand, is it really a person or is it just a prop? You never knew what to expect. So for today's Disney Family Fun Time, I decided I would read a good old Toy Story book on Giddy Up Ghost Town. So this is one of the few 4 books that they had for the Disney's Woody's Roundup Gang, and this one has to do with Bullseye and the Prospector specifically, on how they had a ghost in their town and how they needed to really just find out what the ghost was and what was making all these sounds and how they could save Woody and Jessie. It was a dark, quiet night. Bright stars twinkled in the inky black sky. Woody, the Prospector, Jessie, and Bullseye sprawled around a small, bright campfire. The Roundup Gang was mighty tired after their busy day. They had just captured the worst chicken thief and put him behind bars. Still, they weren't quite ready to head back into the Dry Gulch just yet. "Who's coming for some popcorn?" cried Woody. "I am," said both Jessie and the Prospector. Bullseye just whined. "Well, Jessie," Woody said, "I'll whip us up some popcorn if y'all agree to get some of your ghost stories." "It's a deal," said Jessie. Woody grinned because he loved Jessie's ghost stories. Even though he had heard them many, many times, they still gave him goosebumps and made him look over his shoulder at the slightest noise. The Prospector looked nervous. Sometimes he found Jessie's stories a little bit too scary. "Tell us about the story about the legendary peg-legged pirate of Dry Gulch," Woody said, as he settled down with his popcorn. The Prospector shivered at the thought of the peg-legged pirate. He lived in a cave near Dry Gulch about 100 years ago. Legend had it that the pirate's wicked eyes could still be seen glowing in the dark of night whenever his spirit got angry. The Prospector sure didn't want to hear Jessie tell that story again. "Bullseye's looking mighty thirsty," said the Prospector. "I think I'll take this poor varmint down to the creek to get a drink." And so the Prospector and Bullseye wandered down to the creek for a big gulp of water. It was a calm night, but the crickets were singing loudly. Bullseye drank the water, then started back down towards the campfire. The Prospector followed him, whispering to the horse, "I wish Jessie would just tell a funny story once in a while." Just as they were climbing to the ridge to their campfire, the Prospector heard a strange noise. Something was creaking and clanging, and the noise was coming from the Dry Gulch. The Prospector glanced over at his friends to see if they had heard the noise too, but Jessie was on her feet waving her arms and making scary faces while Woody was wide-eyed and fright and just so engrossed in Jessie's yarn that he wouldn't have heard a whole herd of buffalo go stampeding by. Then, once again, he heard that strange noise coming from Dry Gulch. "What in tarnation is that?" cried the Prospector. He shook his head. And so the Prospector climbed onto Bullseye's back, and the two headed back over to the ridge towards Dry Gulch. As he and Bullseye splashed through the cool water of the creek, the Prospector kept his eyes on Dry Gulch. All appeared calm and quiet, but the quiet was interrupted every few minutes by that strange creaking and clanging sound. "What on earth could be making that noise?" the Prospector wondered out loud. "As a sworn member of the Roundup Gang, it's my duty to help keep the peace out here in the Wild West. I best go investigate and make sure that nobody's in trouble. Giddy up, Bullseye." The Prospector was a little uncertain of what he would do if he actually saw somebody in trouble. After all, he usually just tracked down thieves and troublemakers with Woody and Jessie and Bullseye as a team, but he felt pretty sure he could stop them by himself. "Besides," he told himself, "that creaking noise is probably nothing at all. Maybe someone just left their barn door open and is just swinging back and forth." Except he realized that there wasn't any wind to swing the door back and forth. The Prospector shivered. He tried not to let himself get spooked. He just concentrated on the funny noise and made his way into the Dry Gulch. As he went on the other side of the gulch, there wasn't a single person out on the streets. The general store was completely dark, but the Prospector could see lights coming from windows of some of the houses he passed. "Everything seems to be okay, but it's a little bit too quiet for my liking," the Prospector said to himself. He jumped down and peered into the darkness. Just then the Prospector noticed something odd. What were those strange lights glowing behind the general store? The prospector gulped. It could only be one thing. The glowing eyes of peg-legged Pete. Bullseye looked up and saw the strange shapes too. Before he could stop himself, he gave a frightened neigh. He decided that he had to go and investigate. It was his duty as a member of the Roundup gang. So he climbed up onto Bullseye's back. The prospector moved closer and closer to the weird glowing lights. Just as he passed the sheriff's office, the prospector heard what sounded like shuffling feet behind him. He stopped Bullseye and slid off his back, goosebumps rising up on his arms. But suddenly, the noise stopped. Bullseye gave himself a good shake and a snort. I know, the prospector whispered. We must just be imagining things. Let's just focus on the peg-leg pirate one thing at a time. Just then, the shuffling noises sounded again behind him. This time they were joined by a clinking noise. I'd know that sound anywhere, the prospector said. That sounds like the sounds that spurs make. Spurs. Now who be sneaking around in Dry Gulch and wearing spurs in the middle of the night? The prospector could only come up with one answer to that question. Horse thieves. Okay, Bullseye. Get a hold of yourself. What would Woody and Jesse do? Well, that was easy to figure out. Woody and Jesse would just come up with a great plan to catch the bad guys. They would ride, whooping and hollering throughout the streets, scaring any thieves half to death. But what could he and Bullseye do, all alone? Telling himself to be brave, the prospector forced himself to walk slowly down the street, searching for the source of the noise. That's when the prospector saw something that made his blood run cold and his hair stand up straight. Big white shapes were gliding silently down the street, not a stone's throw away from him. Ghosts! The prospector screamed. I'll stay here and protect the town while you go get help. Run like the wind, Bullseye! Bullseye splashed back across the creek and made a beeline for Woody and Jesse, sitting still at the campfire. The prospector was left shivering, scared in the middle of town. Woody and Jesse looked up in surprise when Bullseye came snorting and galloping up to the campfire. What's got you so excited, Bullseye? Woody asked. You look like you've seen a ghost. Woody snorted and pawed the ground. Woody and Jesse could tell they needed to help their friends, and they needed to help them fast. Bullseye, what's wrong? Asked Jesse. You look really frightened. Where's the prospector? Bullseye snorted and shook his head again. You know, said Woody, it seems that Bullseye is trying to tell us something. Let's see if we can figure out what it is. Bullseye pranced over to the edge of the ridge and shook his head towards the Dry Gulch. I got this one, shouted Jesse. I speak horse. Bullseye's telling us we have to go to the Dry Gulch. What happened in the Dry Gulch? Asked Jesse. Bullseye stepped closer to the campfire, and his horseshoe accidentally clanked against the prospector's gold pan. Milk bottles, Woody yelled. No, Woody. Bullseye's horseshoes are aching, Jesse chimed in. Horseshoes? He's obviously saying the prospector found some gold in the creek and is scared right now in the middle of the street, Woody insisted. That doesn't sound like gold, Jesse argued. Bullseye stood up and moved even closer to the campfire. I got it, cried Jesse. Bullseye tried to put out a bushfire in Dry Gulch. Bullseye knows how dangerous bushfires can be, and that's why he came back to get our help. Poor Bullseye. He knew he had to get back to the Dry Gulch to the prospector. He had no idea why Jesse and Woody kept talking to him instead of coming with him. Aw, baby woodland creatures, hollered Jesse, as she gave him a big hug and rubbed his nose. Bullseye pulled himself away from Jesse and started back towards the Dry Gulch. Whether or not the rest of the game knew it, something was wrong in that town, and they needed to find the prospector to go and investigate. So Woody and Jesse hopped onto Bullseye's back and made their way across the creek towards the Dry Gulch. Better hurry, Woody. I want to help those poor little creatures, said Jesse. Woody and Jesse heard the creaking and clanging noises that first drawn the prospector and Bullseye to the Dry Gulch. When the noise stopped, a voice came out of the darkness. Who goes there? The voice said. Woody and Jesse and Bullseye jumped with a start. We come in peace, said Woody, raising his lantern to see who it was. Well, I'll be hog-tied and dipped in pancake butter. It's you, said the prospector, stepping out from the shadows. But explain that. The prospector pointed into the distance. There they were again, the strange glowing eyes he and Bullseye had seen. The peg-legged pirate, she whispered. Okay, said Woody, trying to sound brave. Let's stay calm. I'm going to sneak up and get a closer look. He crept quietly through some bushes. Jesse close behind him. Woody held his breath. Could it really be the peg-legged pirate? Suddenly, he gasped. Those aren't the pirate's eyes, he cried. They're lanterns. Well, I'll be, said Jesse. I believe you're right. And it was true. The spooky floating eyes were nothing but a bunch of lanterns dangling from some trees. Well, that's one mystery solved, said Woody, but who's hung up these lanterns? Yes, what about those bushfire and the baby woodland creatures? Asked Jesse. Bushfire? There wasn't any bushfire. Why did you tell them that, you silly horse? Sure as day there were thieves sneaking around the Dry Gulch. The prospector shook his head and started in the direction of the sheriff's building. Maybe they'd see the horse thieves on their way. So the roundup gang followed the prospector. As they got close to the sheriff's office, there was a faint shuffling and jingling sound. Bullseye's ears picked up. Bullseye hears something, cried Jesse. Shh, said the prospector. Why, that sounds like people walking. And the sound is coming from the other side of Woody's office. Let's go look, said the prospector. The roundup gang rushed towards the back of the sheriff's office and saw a whole crowd of townspeople going for a walk. They smiled and said hello to the roundup gang. They were dressed up very nicely, and many of them were carrying bulging sacks. Evening, ma'am. What's going on? Oh, nothing, Sheriff, she answered politely. We're just all trying to get a bit of exercise and fresh air. But it's nighttime, said Jesse, and you're all dressed up. The woman just smiled at her and waved as she walked past him. Woody shook his head. Come on, let's go into my office and just try to put this whole thing together. Bullseye stayed outside while the three trapped into Woody's office. The prospector still felt a little sheepish, seeing as how the eyes of the peg-legged pirate had turned out to be lanterns and the supposed horse thieves were really just townspeople out for a moonlight stroll. But the prospector was sure they'd seen some ghosts. Where did you see those baby woodland creatures? What, Jesse, for heck's sake, there weren't any woodland creatures, the prospector said, fuming mad. Why ain't you listening to the horse for? I say if we saw ghosts, and you gotta believe me on this one. The prospector stormed out of the sheriff's office. Woody and Jesse right behind him, and the prospector led the gang towards the general store where he'd last seen the ghost. The gang made their way silently around to the back of the general store. As soon as they slowly turned the corner into the backyard, they heard, Surprise! There, spread out in front of them, was a huge party. All the townspeople had gathered for a celebration. There were long tables set up with lots of cookies and cakes and ice cream on them. There were several lanterns tied to tree branches, and, best of all, there was a giant banner draped between trees which said, The citizens of Dry Gulch salute the Roundup Gang. 3 cheers for Sheriff Woody and the Roundup Gang, cried someone else. As the whole crowd cheered, the prospector scratched his head. He had an explanation for the strange noises, the spooky floating eyes, and the horse thieves. But what about the ghosts? Then he noticed the tables were covered with crisp white cloths. He must have seen the sneaky party-goers carrying the tablecloths. All in all, it's been a mixed-up night, said the prospector. Yeah, but this is ruined tunest party I've ever seen, cried Jesse. And it's in our honor. Yeehaw! Well, thanks for getting the gang to come to my rescue party, Bullseye, said the prospector, giving the horse a big hug. Jesse and Woody joined him. I'm glad there weren't any pirates or ghosts or horse or thieves, said Woody. It just goes to show you, you can't believe everything you see or think you might see in the shadows. Jessie threw her hat up into the air as they all had a fun night.